I don't care what the zoning board says, Richard. I'll bury them. Arthur Pendleton barked into his phone, storming into the first-class cabin only to freeze at seat 1A. He glared at David Sterling, a quiet black man in a simple charcoal hoodie with pure, unadulterated disdain. "Beatrice," he sneered at the flight attendant, "get this riffraff out of my sight. I always sit in 1A. Arthur thought his bespoke suit made him untouchable, oblivious to the fact that the man he just branded riffraff didn't just pay for a ticket. He owned the proprietary rights to the very Boeing 777 they were standing on. By demanding David be moved, Arthur wasn't just cleared of a seatmate, he was hand-delivering the evidence to the only man capable of foreclosing on his entire existence before the plane even left the tarmac. Terminal 4 at JFK International Airport hummed with the chaotic, relentless energy typical of a rainy Friday evening. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the tarmac was a sea of flashing strobe lights and slick, wet concrete. David Sterling stood near the priority boarding lane for Meridian Airlines Flight 114 to London Heathrow, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. David was a man who commanded rooms, boardrooms, and global markets. But you wouldn't know it to look at him tonight. At 42, he was the founder and CEO of Sterling Logistics and Aviation, a massive supply chain and aircraft leasing conglomerate. His net worth hovered comfortably in the multi-billions. Yet his travel attire was strictly designed for comfort. He wore a high-quality, unbranded charcoal cashmere hoodie, dark-tailored jeans, and a pair of clean, understated sneakers. His dark skin caught the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal, highlighting the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. It had been a grueling 72 hours of hostile takeovers and endless negotiations. All he wanted was to sink into the plush leather of seat 1A, put on his noise-cancelling headphones, and sleep until the wheels touched down in London. First class and Diamond Medallion members, you may now board. The gate agent announced, her voice echoing over the PA system. David handed his boarding pass and passport to the agent. She scanned it, offered a warm, professional smile, and handed it back. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Sterling. Have a wonderful flight." "Thank you, Sarah," David replied, noting her name tag. He walked down the jet bridge, the familiar smell of jet fuel and sanitized air washing over him. At the door of the Boeing 777, he was greeted by the chief flight attendant. Her name tag read, Beatrice. Beatrice was a veteran of the skies, a woman in her late 50s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. She possessed a sharp, calculating gaze that swept over passengers, silently categorizing them within a fraction of a second. When her eyes landed on David, the professional warmth she had just offered to the elderly white couple ahead of him instantly evaporated. Her smile tightened into a thin, rigid line. She took in his hoodie, his sneakers, and his race, her bias acting as a faulty filter. "Boarding passes, please," Beatrice said, her tone noticeably clipped. David held out his phone, the digital pass displaying seat 1A first class. Beatrice barely glanced at the screen. "Sir, economy is down the aisle and to the right. Please keep moving so others can board." David paused, lowering his phone. He looked at her, his expression perfectly neutral. He had experienced these microaggressions 1,000 times in his life, from high-end boutiques to corporate elevators. It never stopped stinging, but he had long ago learned how to weaponize his calm against it. "I am in 1A," David said, his voice quiet but resonant. He held the screen closer to her face. "First class right here." Beatrice visibly stiffened. She leaned in, squinting at the digital barcode, as if she expected the pixels to morph into a forgery right before her eyes. When the screen obstinately continued to display 1A, she offered a tight, forced nod. "My mistake," she muttered, not sounding the least bit apologetic. "Right this way." David didn't wait for her to lead him. He stepped into the sprawling, luxurious first-class cabin, found his suite at the very front left of the aircraft, and stowed his small leather duffel bag in the overhead bin. He settled into the wide, lie-flat seat, letting out a long sigh as he closed his eyes. The ambient lighting of the cabin was soothing, a soft violet hue designed to relax passengers. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. 10 minutes later, that peace was shattered by the arrival of Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was the kind of man who announced his presence before he even entered a room. He came storming down the jet bridge, barking loudly into a cell phone, his face flushed with self-importance. He was a wealthy real estate developer from Manhattan, old money, deeply entrenched in a network of country clubs and closed-door agreements. He wore a bespoke navy pinstripe suit, a heavy gold Rolex glinting on his wrist, and carried an aura of absolute entitlement. "I don't care what the zoning board says, Richard. You tell them, I'll pull the funding. I'll bury them." Arthur shouted into his phone, finally lowering it as he stepped onto the plane. Beatrice's demeanor transformed instantly. The rigid, judgmental posture she had used with David was replaced by a exaggerated eagerness. "Mr. Pendleton, welcome back," Beatrice cooped, practically beaming. "It's a pleasure to have you flying with us again. Let me take your coat." Yes, Beatrice. "Good to see you," Arthur said dismissively, shrugging off his trench coat and handing it to her without a second glance. "Long day. I need a scotch." "Neat. Macallan 18 if you have it, and I need to get into 1A immediately." Arthur strode into the first-class cabin, not bothering to check his boarding pass. He walked straight toward the front left suite, completely expecting it to be empty and waiting for him as he believed the world should be. Instead, he stopped short. There, resting comfortably in seat 1A with his eyes closed, was David. Arthur's face contorted into a mask of indignation. He looked at David's casual attire, then at his skin color, and a sneer curled his lip. He turned sharply on his heel and snapped his fingers towards the galley. "Beatrice!" Arthur called out, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. "There seems to be a problem here. Someone is sitting in my seat." David heard the commotion, but kept his eyes closed. He recognized the tone, the shrill, demanding pitch of a man who was accustomed to the world, bending over backward to accommodate his whims. He hoped, perhaps naively, that the flight attendant would simply correct the man and direct him to his actual seat. Beatrice hurried over her heels, clicking rapidly against the carpeted floor. "What seems to be the issue, Mr. Pendleton?" "This," Arthur said, gesturing aggressively toward David as if David were a piece of misplaced luggage. "This man is in 1A. I always sit in 1A. Beatrix looked at David and then at Arthur. She didn't ask to see Arthur's boarding pass. She didn't check the manifest on her tablet. Her bias had already written the narrative. Arthur belonged here, and David was an anomaly, a system error that needed to be corrected. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Pendleton," Beatrice said soothingly. She turned to David, her voice dropping an octave, replacing the syrupy sweetness with a cold, authoritative edge. "Excuse me, sir." David slowly opened his eyes and removed his noise-cancelling headphones. "Yes, I need you to gather your things and vacate this seat," Beatrice said. She stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, projecting an air of absolute authority. "There has been a booking error." David remained seated. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he break eye contact. "There is no booking error. I scanned my pass at the gate, and I showed it to you when I boarded. I am in 1A. Sir Beatrice said the word, dripping with condescension. "Mr. Pendleton is a frequent flyer with Meridian Airlines. He has requested this seat. I am going to have to ask you to move to the back. We can find you a comfortable spot in premium economy, and I will personally see to it that you are compensated with drink vouchers." Drink vouchers! For a man whose company literally supplied the fuel that powered the engines on this aircraft. The sheer absurdity of the offer almost made David laugh, but the underlying disrespect kept his features locked in a hard, impassive stare. "I am not moving to premium economy," David said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "I paid for first class. I selected this seat weeks ago. Check your tablet. Check the manifest." Arthur scoffed loudly, crossing his arms. "Oh, please look at him, Beatrice. It's a glitch in the app. Probably a standby upgrade that didn't process right. Just move him." I have a massive merger to prepare for, and I cannot be dealing with this sort of riffraff." The word hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Riffraff. Several other passengers in the first-class cabin had stopped settling in and were now watching the exchange. A wealthy older woman in 2B looked appalled, while a young tech executive in 1D frowned, pulling his phone out to pretend he wasn't listening. David slowly sat forward. The easygoing posture was gone, replaced by the shark-like intensity that made him one of the most feared negotiators on Wall Street. "Riffraff," David repeated, locking eyes with Arthur. "Is that what you call someone who holds a valid ticket for a seat you feel entitled to simply because you prefer it?" "I call it like I see it," Arthur sneered, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate David. "People like you think you can just flash a glitchy app and sit wherever you please. You don't belong in this cabin. Now take your little backpack and move along before this gets embarrassing for you." "Mr. Pendleton, please let me handle this." Beatrice intervened, placing a reassuring hand on Arthur's arm, before turning a glare on David. "Sir, I am not going to ask you again. I'm going to ask you. You are causing a disturbance. Aviation regulations require you to follow the instructions of the flight crew. If you do not vacate this seat immediately, I will be forced to call security and have you removed from the aircraft." David looked at Beatrice. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she had completely bypassed all protocol to appease a wealthy white passenger at the expense of a black passenger. She hadn't even checked Arthur's ticket. "You haven't checked his boarding pass?" David pointed out softly. "I don't need to," Beatrice snapped. "I know, Mr. Pendleton." "Now are you going to move or am I calling the gate?" "Call them," David said. He leaned back in his seat, resting his elbows on the armrests, and steepled his fingers. "In fact, I insist you call them. Call security. Call the captain because I am not moving a single inch." Beatrice's face flushed with anger. She was not used to being defied, certainly not by someone she had already dismissed as beneath her notice. "Fine, you brought this on yourself." She spun around and marched briskly towards the galley intercom, her hand trembling slightly with rage. Arthur let out a triumphant bark of laughter. "You're making a huge mistake, buddy," Arthur said, leaning against the partition of the suite. "You're about to get dragged off this plane in handcuffs. Hope the cheap flight was worth the felony charge." David didn't respond to Arthur. Instead, he calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He ignored the murmurs of the other passengers. He ignored the furious glare Arthur was aiming at him. He opened his contacts and scrolled past industry titans, senators, and billionaires, stopping on a specific name, Richard Vance, VP of Fleet Operations. Wait, he couldn't use the name Vance. He corrected his mental Rolodex. Richard Sterling. "No, let's go with Jonathan Hayes, Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Airlines." David tapped the name. The phone rang twice before it was picked up. "David." Jonathan Hayes' voice BM'd through the earpiece, sounding slightly out of breath, but thoroughly professional. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I thought you were wheels up for London by now." "Not quite, John," David said, his voice maintaining its steady, unbothered cadence. "I'm currently sitting on the tarmac at JFK on one of your 77's flight 114. "Ah, the flagship route," Jonathan said happily. "Everything to your liking. I told the executive team to make sure your profile was flagged for VIP treatment after we closed the leasing agreement yesterday." "That's actually why I'm calling David," replied, his eyes tracking Beatrice as she spoke frantically into the wall-mounted phone in the galley, gesturing wildly in his direction. "It seems there's a disconnect between corporate protocol and cabin crew operations. Your chief flight attendant has informed me that my ticket is invalid and she is currently calling Port Authority police to have me forcibly removed from the aircraft." There was a dead heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Jonathan finally spoke, the jovial tone was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp panic. "She is doing what? She is attempting to reseat me in economy to make room for another passenger who claims he prefers my seat," David explained methodically. "A Mr. Pendleton. She has refused to verify my boarding pass and has threatened me with arrest. David, I am so incredibly sorry." Jonathan stammered, the horror evident in his voice. Jonathan knew exactly who David Sterling was. Sterling's holding company didn't just lease aircraft to Meridian. As of yesterday's ink-drying signature, Sterling Aviation owned the proprietary rights to the very Boeing 777. David was sitting in, along with 40 others in the Meridian fleet. David wasn't just a VIP. He was practically their landlord. "I don't need an apology, John. I need a resolution," David said calmly. "Because as it stands, I am not feeling very confident in Meridian's management of my assets. If this is how you treat paying customers, I shudder to think how you treat the equipment. I am fixing this right now. Do not move. Give me 60 seconds, Jonathan said, and the line abruptly went dead. David lowered his phone. Arthur was still standing there, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered across his face. "Calling your lawyer," Arthur mocked. "Save your breath. The cops are already on their way down the jet bridge. You're done." Sure enough, the heavy thud of boots echoed from the front of the aircraft. Two Port Authority police officers, flanked by a highly stressed-looking gate agent, stepped onto the plane. Beatrice met them immediately, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Officers, thank goodness," Beatrice said loudly, ensuring the entire first-class cabin could hear her. "This man is trespassing in first class. He is refusing to follow crew instructions. He is being belligerent, and he is making Mr. Pendleton and myself feel unsafe. I want him off my aircraft." The officers, looking stern and ready for an altercation, approached Suite 1A. "Sir," the older officer said, placing a hand on his utility belt, "we need you to gather your items and step off the plane with us." David looked at the officers. He felt a familiar sickening drop in his stomach. The racial profiling, the escalation to law enforcement, the inherent danger of the situation. But he held his ground. "Officers, I am sitting in the seat I paid for," David said, keeping his hands clearly visible on his lap. "I have my boarding pass. The flight attendant has refused to look at it. She is attempting to give my seat away to this man simply because he asked for it." "That is a lie," Beatrice shrieked. "He is disruptive. Sir, we can sort this out at the gate." The second officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But right now, the captain has the final say on who flies, and the crew wants you off. You need to stand up." Before David could respond, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Stand down, officers." Everyone turned. Emerging from the cockpit was Captain Thomas Reynolds. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and 4 gold stripes on his epaulets. He was clutching an iPad, his face pale, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. "Captain," Beatrice said, looking relieved, "I was just having this unruly passenger removed." "Quiet, Beatrice." Captain Reynolds snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Beatrice's mouth snapped shut, her eyes widening in shock. The captain practically shoved his way past the officers and Arthur, coming to a halt right in front of David's seat. To the absolute astonishment of Beatrice, Arthur, and the police officers, Captain Reynolds did not look angry. He looked terrified. "Mr. Sterling," Captain Reynolds said, his voice trembling slightly. He offered a deep, respectful nod. I just received a direct emergency dispatch from the Chief Operating Officer, Jonathan Hayes." Arthur rolled his eyes. "Captain, who cares what dispatch says? Get this guy out of my seat so we can take off." Captain Reynolds slowly turned his head to look at Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton, if you utter one more word, I will have you removed from this aircraft for interfering with flight operations." Arthur's jaw dropped. The smugness evaporated, replaced by utter confusion. Captain Reynolds turned back to David, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Sterling, Sir Mr. Hayes has informed me of the situation. I want to offer my profound personal apologies on behalf of Meridian Airlines." Beatrice stepped forward, her perfectly manicured reality crumbling. "Captain, what are you doing? He's in the wrong seat." "He is in exactly the right seat, Beatrice." Captain Reynolds said, his voice practically a growl. "Because, as of yesterday, Mr. Sterling's company owns this airplane. He owns the lease on the aircraft. He owns the fuel contract for our East Coast hub, and he could bankrupt this airline with a single phone call." So I suggest you rethink your next words very, very carefully. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the first-class cabin. The only sound was the hum of the auxiliary power unit. Beatrix's face drained of all colour. She stared at David, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The realization of her monumental career-ending mistake crashed down upon her. Arthur Pendleton, the man who had called David riffraff, suddenly looked very small in his bespoke suit. He took a slow step backward. David finally stood up. He smoothed the front of his cashmere hoodie and looked at the captain. "Captain Reynolds," David said quietly, the authority radiating off him in waves. "I am a reasonable man. I do not like to use my influence to disrupt operations, but I will not be treated like a second-class citizen on an aircraft I own by a crew whose salaries I essentially pay." "I understand completely, sir," the captain said, swallowing hard. "How would you like us to proceed?" David looked past the captain, his eyes locking onto Beatrice, who was now visibly shaking, and then onto Arthur, who was staring at his shoes. First, David said, his voice echoing in the dead silent cabin, "Ground the plane." The words, "ground the plane," hit the cabin like a physical shockwave. Captain Thomas Reynolds stood frozen, his hand still gripping the edge of the partition. The two Port Authority police officers exchanged an uneasy glance, suddenly hyper-aware that the unruly passenger they had been called to forcefully remove was in fact the man who held the financial reins of the entire airline. They slowly took their hands off their utility belts instinctively, taking a collective step backward to distance themselves from Beatrice. "Sir," Captain Reynolds stammered, his professional composure cracking under the immense weight of the situation grounding the flight. "There are 312 passengers on board. We have a narrow departure window and the logistical cascading effect." "Captain, I am well aware of the logistical cascading effect of a grounded Boeing 777. David interrupted, his voice devoid of anger but entirely inflexible. "But I am looking at a chief flight attendant who just bypassed every Federal Aviation Administration verification protocol to falsely accuse a passenger of trespassing and belligerence solely based on her personal bias. Furthermore, she weaponized law enforcement to enforce her prejudice." David turned his gaze to the officers. "Gentlemen, did she or did she not tell you I was belligerent and refusing to show my boarding pass?" The older officer cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "She did, sir," she stated. "You were a threat to the safety of the cabin." David looked back at the captain. A flight attendant who lies to federal authorities and ignores the passenger manifest is a flight attendant who cannot be trusted with the safety of a multi-million-dollar aircraft and over 300 lives. "This crew is compromised. Ground the plane." Captain Reynolds swallowed hard. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and absolute fury. "Everybody off," the captain said quietly, then louder, reaching for the PA handset on the galley wall. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen and severe administrative issue regarding crew compliance, we are forced to return to the gate and deplane all passengers immediately. Further instructions will be provided in the terminal." A collective groan laced with confusion and frustration echoed from the economy cabin behind them. Beatrice's pristine facade entirely collapsed. The blood rushed from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She reached out her hand, hovering in the air as if trying to physically catch the words the captain had just spoken. "Captain, wait, please." Beatrice begged, her voice shrill and desperate. "You can't do this. I was just doing my job. I was protecting our elite passengers." "You were protecting your own arrogance," David said, cutting her off with surgical precision. "You looked at a black man in a hoodie and decided against all empirical evidence and digital documentation that I did not belong in your presence. You didn't even ask to see Mr. Pendleton's boarding pass. You just assumed he was right and I was wrong." Arthur Pendleton, who had been attempting to shrink into the background, suddenly felt the spotlight swing back to him. His aggressive bravado from 5 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by the frantic calculating panic of a man who realized he had just insulted a leviathan. "Look, let's not blow this out of proportion." Arthur interjected, forcing a nervous, placating chuckle. He straightened his bespoke tie, trying to regain a sliver of authority. It was a simple misunderstanding, a mix-up. I'll gladly take my actual seat in 2A. No harm, no foul. Right. Let's just get in the air. I have a massive merger with a logistics firm in London tomorrow morning. Hundreds of millions of dollars are on the line, Mr. Sterling. Surely a man of your business acumen understands the necessity of keeping the wheels turning. David slowly turned his head to look at Arthur. A cold, terrifying realization was beginning to dawn behind David's eyes. He tilted his head slightly. A logistics firm, David murmured softly. You're Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton Group Real Estate. Yes, exactly. Arthur said, his face brightening completely, misreading the situation. He stepped forward, offering a hand. Arthur Pendleton, we're acquiring prime industrial waterfront property in the UK to lease out to global supply chain operators. It's a game-changer. So you see, we're practically in the same industry. Let's just shake on this. And you are meeting with Gregory Pierce. David stated, ignoring the outstretched hand. Arthur's hand froze in midair. His smile faltered. How? How do you know Greg? Because Gregory Pierce is the Vice President of European Acquisitions for Sterling Logistics. David said, his voice dropping to a register that chilled the air in the cabin. He works for me. You are flying to London to pitch my company on a $400 million waterfront lease. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a man's career, his ego and his future hitting a brick wall at 500 meters an hour. Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face cycled through shock, denial, and finally abject horror. The man he had just called riffraff, the man he had actively tried to have dragged off a plane by armed police, was the sole decision-maker for the biggest deal of his life. You, Arthur whispered, his knees visibly weakening. You're that Sterling. I am, David replied, turning his back on Arthur. He looked at the gate agent who was hovering near the cockpit door. Rebook all the economy and business class passengers on the next available flights, including competitors' airlines. My holding company will cover the difference in fares, and I want every single passenger given a $3,000 voucher for the inconvenience. Bring the invoice directly to my office on Monday. He paused, glancing over his shoulder at the two devastated figures standing in the aisle. Except for Mr. Pendleton, David added smoothly. He won't be flying tonight. He no longer has a meeting in London. 30 minutes later, the Boeing 777 sat empty at the gate, effectively a $70 million paperweight. The rain continued to lash against the massive windows of the Meridian Airlines VIP Platinum Lounge. The lounge had been completely cleared of other guests. The heavy mahogany doors were shut, guarded outside by the two Port Authority officers who were now acting more as bouncers for David Sterling than airport security. Inside the atmosphere was a tribunal. David sat at the head of a long, polished granite conference table. His hoodie was still on a stark visual contrast to the rigid, terrified corporate executives scrambling around him. A massive screen at the end of the room was illuminated, displaying the live video feed of Jonathan Hayes, the Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Airlines, calling in from his home office. Jonathan looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last half hour. Sitting opposite David were Beatrice and Arthur. They had been instructed to wait. Beatrice was weeping silently, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her perfect hair now slightly disheveled. Arthur stared blankly at the tabletop, his expensive suit looking like a straitjacket. Next to Beatrice sat a very uncomfortable-looking union representative named Harrison Caldwell, who had been pulled from his dinner break to mitigate a disaster he didn't yet fully understand. Let's begin, David said, his voice cutting through the quiet sobbing. On the screen, Jonathan Hayes cleared his throat. Mr. Sterling, on behalf of the entire executive board of Meridian, I cannot express how deeply ashamed we are of this incident. I have already drafted a press release, and we are prepared to offer any concessions you require regarding the fleet lease. The lease is fine, Jonathan, for now, David said calmly. He steepled his fingers, his eyes locking on to Beatrice. Harrison, as Beatrice's union representative, I assume you have reviewed the written statements from Captain Reynolds, the 2 Port Authority officers, and the 4 other first-class passengers who witnessed the event. Harrison Caldwell flipped nervously through the manila folder in front of him. He looked at Beatrice, then at David, and sighed heavily. I have, Mr. Sterling. Does the Flight Attendants Union condone the deliberate bypassing of passenger verification protocols? David asked. No, Sir, Harrison admitted quietly. Does the union condone calling armed law enforcement on a compliant ticketed passenger based on racial profiling and personal bias? Beatrice let out a sharp sob. It wasn't racial. I thought he was a threat. He was wearing a hoodie in first class. David didn't raise his voice, but the sheer force of his glare pinned her to her chair. I am the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire. I dictate the supply chain for half the eastern seaboard. I wear a hoodie because I work 80-hour weeks and I value comfort over performing wealth for people like you. But you didn't see my net worth, Beatrice. You saw my skin. You saw my clothes. And you decided I was inherently dangerous and unworthy of the space I paid for. David leaned forward, tapping a single sheet of paper on the table. My security team ran a rudimentary background check on your employee file while we were deplaning. In the last 5 years, you have logged 14 unruly passenger complaints. 12 of those complaints were against people of color. None of them resulted in arrests, meaning you repeatedly use security as a personal concierge service to remove minorities who don't sufficiently bow to your authority. Harrison Caldwell closed the manila folder. He didn't even try to formulate a defense. The data was damning. Beatrice Jonathan Hayes said from the video screen, his voice grim. As of this exact moment, your employment with Meridian Airlines is terminated with cause. You are permanently banned from operating on any aircraft leased or owned by Meridian or its partners. You will surrender your badge to Mr. Caldwell immediately. Beatrice let out a wail, burying her face in her hands. Please, I have 2 years left until my full pension. You're ruining my life over a misunderstanding. You ruined your own career the moment you decided your prejudice was more important than your professionalism. David replied coldly. You weaponized the police against me in a different context with a different passenger. Your misunderstanding could have gotten someone killed. You are done flying. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Caldwell gently touched Beatrix's arm, guiding the sobbing woman out of the heavy mahogany doors. Now only Arthur Pendleton remained. Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. Mr. Sterling, David, please. We are businessmen. We understand that sometimes in the heat of the moment things are said, things are revealed, Arthur, David corrected him. Not just said revealed. You called me riffraff. You told me to take my little backpack and move along. You demanded I be arrested for sitting in a seat I rightfully purchased. David pulled his phone out of his pocket and placed it flat on the granite table. He tapped the screen a few times, dialing a number. He put it on speakerphone. The phone rang once. David, good evening? A crisp, British accented voice answered. It was Gregory Pearce. I wasn't expecting to hear from you until you landed at Heathrow. Change of plans, Greg. I'm still in New York. David said, his eyes never leaving Arthur's pale face. Tell me about the Pendleton Group acquisition. The waterfront logistics hub, Greg replied enthusiastically over the speaker. It's a beautiful piece of real estate, David. Pendleton's firm is asking for $400 million, but I think I can negotiate them down to $380. Arthur Pendleton is flying in tomorrow morning to sign the preliminary exclusivity agreement. Arthur pressed his hands flat against the table, his knuckles turning white. He was silently pleading, shaking his head. Please. No. Cancel the agreement, Greg. David said, his tone entirely conversational. There was a brief pause on the line. Cancel it completely, David. We've spent 3 months on due diligence. I am aware, David said. But I have just had a personal interaction with Arthur Pendleton. He lacks the integrity, the foresight, and the basic human decency required to partner with Sterling Logistics. He is a liability to our corporate culture. Terminate the negotiations immediately. Do not accept any further calls from his firm. Arthur let out a sound that was half gasp, half groan. It was the sound of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. The waterfront deal was the linchpin of his firm's quarterly survival. Without it, he was dangerously over-leveraged. "Understood, David?" Greg said, professionally never questioning his boss. "I'll draft the termination notice and send it to their legal team within the hour." "Thank you, Greg. Have a good weekend," David said, ending the call. The silence returned to the VIP lounge, heavier and more oppressive than before. David stood up, picking up his small leather duffel bag. He looked down at Arthur, who was staring vacantly at the granite table, completely broken. "You thought the world belonged to you because you wear a nice suit and carry a heavy watch," David said softly, leaning over the table. "You thought you could step on whoever you wanted because you assumed they had no power. Let this be a very expensive lesson, Arthur. The world does not bend to your arrogance, and the people you dismiss as riffraff might just own the ground you're trying to walk on." David turned towards the screen. "Jonathan, have my private jet prepped at Teterboro. I'm tired of flying commercial tonight." "Right away," Mr. Sterling, the COO, replied instantly. David walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, his sneakers silent against the plush carpet, leaving the shattered remnants of absolute entitlement in his wake. The silence David Sterling left behind in the VIP lounge was profound, but the quiet did not last long. In the modern world, absolute power doesn't just act, it echoes. And on a commercial flight filled with high net worth individuals, tech executives, and restless passengers, nothing truly happens in a vacuum. Sitting in seat 1D during the entire ordeal was a man named Tyler Bennett. Tyler was a prominent freelance investigative journalist who frequently contributed to major business publications. While he had pretended to be engrossed in his phone during the initial altercation between David Beatrice and Arthur, his camera had been rolling the entire time. The lens had captured it all. Arthur's sneering riffraff comment, Beatrice's blatant refusal to check the digital ticket, her weaponization of the Port Authority police, and the terrifying immediate reversal of fortune when Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit. By the time David Sterling's private Gulfstream G650ER was wheels up from Teterboro Airport, ascending into the quiet night sky above the cloud line, Tyler Bennett was hitting upload from a terminal cafe. The video hit the internet like a seismic charge. Tyler posted it with a simple, factual caption. Meridian Airlines Flight 114 grounded. Flight attendant and entitled passenger. Attempt to forcibly remove black passenger from 1A. Turns out he owns the plane. Within 4 hours, the footage had crossed 3 million views. By sunrise on Saturday, it was the #1 trending topic globally across every major social media platform. The internet, ever hungry for a clear-cut narrative of righteous karma, devoured the story. They analysed Arthur Pendleton's bespoke suit and arrogant posture, contrasting it with David's calm, stoic demeanour in his grey hoodie. The corporate fallout for Meridian Airlines was immediate, but surprisingly manageable entirely due to David's swift action. The airline's PR department, operating under strict, terrified orders from COO Jonathan Hayes, released a statement before the morning news cycle even began. They publicly apologized to David Sterling, confirmed the immediate termination of the flight attendant involved, and announced a comprehensive top-down audit of crew conduct and passenger verification protocols. Because they acted decisively, abandoning Beatrice to the wolves, the airline's stock took only a minor dip before stabilizing. Beatrice and Arthur, however, found no such shelter. Beatrice, foolishly believing she could control the narrative, attempted to play the victim. By Sunday afternoon, a GoFundMe campaign appeared under her name titled Unfairly Fired Help a Dedicated Flight Attendant, Fight Corporate Bullying. In the description, she claimed she was simply following safety protocols and was unjustly targeted by a vindictive billionaire. She raised exactly $4,000 before the internet sleuths went to work. A whistleblower from within the Flight Attendants Union, disgusted by the video, leaked Beatrix's disciplinary file to a digital news outlet. The headline published Monday morning was damning. 14 prior complaints fired Meridian attendant has history of profiling minority passengers. The article detailed how she routinely used security as an intimidation tactic against people of color. Within hours of the article's publication, GoFundMe suspended her campaign for violating their terms of service regarding hate speech and harassment, refunding all donations. Beatrix's pension, which she was 2 years away from securing, was locked in legal battles she could no longer afford to fight. She was entirely blacklisted from the aviation industry. But the hardest karma was reserved for Arthur Pendleton. Arthur's entire real estate empire was built on leverage perception and a carefully curated image of invincibility. The viral video shattered that image overnight. He wasn't seen as a titan of industry. He was exposed as a petulant racist bully who had spectacularly torpedoed his own company out of sheer arrogance. On Monday morning, the London waterfront logistics deal officially dissolved. The news of the $400 million contract cancellation leaked to the Wall Street Journal, creating a panic among Pendleton Group's investors. Arthur tried to spin it. He called his contacts at Bloomberg, desperately trying to frame the situation as a hostile corporate sabotage by Sterling Logistics. "It's a hit job," Arthur stammered into the phone to a reporter. "Sterling is trying to devalue my assets so he can swoop in." But the market didn't care about his excuses. They cared about the video. And the video showed a man with atrocious judgment. By Tuesday, 2 of Pendleton Group's primary financial backers pulled their funding, citing a breach of their corporate morality clauses. Pendleton Group stock plummeted by 42% in a single trading session. Arthur was hemorrhaging money, credibility and time, and David Sterling hadn't even finished tightening the vice. 3 months had passed since the incident on Flight 114, but for Arthur Pendleton, it felt like a decade of relentless drowning. The Pendleton Group's headquarters, a sprawling glass and steel penthouse overlooking Central Park, used to feel like Mount Olympus to Arthur. Today, it felt like a mausoleum. Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, his reflection in the polished wood showing a man hollowed out by relentless, suffocating stress. His bespoke suits now hung loosely on a frame that had shed 20. His deep, arrogant tan had faded into a sickly greyish paler. The heavy gold Rolex was gone, pawned quietly to cover a minor margin call 2 weeks prior. The viral video had been the initial spark, but the inferno that consumed his empire was purely financial. When David Sterling's European division publicly terminated the $400 million London waterfront deal, it acted as a signal flare to the rest of the market. Wall Street smells blood in the water faster than a great white shark, and Arthur was suddenly bleeding from a dozen severed credit lines. Around the table sat his board of directors, their faces set in identical masks of grim self-preservation. William Danforth, the aging ruthless chairman of the board, tapped a gold pen against a thick stack of legal documents. To Danforth's right sat Eleanor Hastings, the chief financial officer who wouldn't even meet Arthur's eyes. The liquidation parameters are set. Arthur Danforth said, his voice as cold and hard as a marble floor. "We breached the covenants on the Midtown Tower loans yesterday at 5 p.m. The cross-default clauses have triggered. The banks are preparing to seize everything. We are officially illiquid." Arthur gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles white. "We just need a bridge loan, William. Give me 72 hours. I have a meeting with a private equity firm in Chicago tomorrow. They specialize in distressed assets. They can float us until the next quarter." Elena finally looked up, her expression a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "There is no meeting in Chicago. Arthur, they canned this morning. No one is going to underwrite a firm run by a man who became a global symbol of racist entitlement. You are financially radioactive. So what is this?" Arthur demanded, his voice cracking as he gestured wildly to the thick stack of papers in front of Danforth. "Bankruptcy. We just surrender." "It's an acquisition," Danforth corrected sharply. "A hostile one, but an acquisition nonetheless. We received a closed-door offer last night. A conglomerate is stepping in to purchase our commercial leases and active construction sites. The offer covers the senior debt and provides a marginal severance to keep the board out of federal court. You, however, will forfeit your equity entirely." Arthur's heart pounded violently against his ribs. Forfeit his equity. That meant walking away with zero. The company his grandfather had founded, the empire Arthur had expanded with ruthless cutthroat tactics, gone in the blink of an eye. He would be left with nothing but legal fees and public disgrace. Who, Arthur croaked, the fight draining out of him. Who is buying us? I believe the acquiring party has just arrived, Danforth said, glancing towards the heavy frosted glass double doors of the boardroom. The doors swung open. Arthur stopped breathing. The air in the room seemed to freeze, growing thick and suffocating. Walking into the boardroom, flanked by two sharp-suited corporate attorneys, was David Sterling. He was not wearing a grey cashmere hoodie today. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit that radiated an immense, unshakable gravity. Behind him walked Gregory Pearce, the British VP of Acquisitions, who had effectively ended Arthur's life 3 months ago with a single phone call. David walked slowly towards the table, his expression exactly as calm and unbothered as it had been in seat 1A. There was no gloating smirk, no theatrical villain. He looked like a man executing a routine, albeit tedious administrative task. "Good morning, William." "Elenina," David said smoothly, offering a polite nod to the board members. He stopped at the opposite end of the table, his dark eyes finally locking on to Arthur. Arthur tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. He finally whispered the word, scraping out of his mouth. "You're the buyer. I am buying your supply chain contracts and your physical warehouse leases." "Yes," David stated, his voice steady. "I have no use for your residential portfolio or your brand. In fact, the first stipulation of this buyout is that the Pendleton name is legally dissolved from all corporate registries by Friday." Gregory Pearce stepped forward, sliding the massive stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany toward Arthur. A sleek Mont Blanc pen rested on top. Arthur's hands began to shake uncontrollably. "You orchestrated this," he accused, his voice rising in a desperate, greedy panic. "You killed the London deal just so you could starve me out. You leaked that video to devalue my firm so you could buy me for pennies." David tilted his head slightly, a gesture of mild correction. "I didn't leak the video, Arthur. The internet did that, and I didn't have to orchestrate your downfall. I simply stopped catching you when you jumped. When I cancelled the London deal, I expected you to pivot. Instead, you panicked. You over-leveraged your midtown assets to cover the margin calls. You acted out of desperation." Arthur's jaw dropped. The board members shifted uncomfortably. "When I saw your financial filings, I didn't just sit back." David explained, his tone entirely conversational. "Sterling Logistics quietly acquired the secondary notes on your commercial loans through a proxy firm. Every time you missed a payment these last 4 weeks, you weren't defaulting to the bank. You were defaulting to me. I hold the paper on your entire existence. I am not just buying your company, Arthur. I am foreclosing on your arrogance." Arthur looked down at the contract. The purchase price was a masterclass in corporate execution. It would cover the debts and shield the board from personal liability, but Arthur's net worth would be wiped out entirely. "Sign the papers," Arthur Danforth ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Or the board will execute an emergency vote, remove you as CEO and sign them in your absence. Either way, you are done." Arthur looked at David one last time, searching for a flicker of mercy, a hint of the reasonableness he had arrogantly assumed he could manipulate on that airplane. He found nothing but a cold, impenetrable wall of consequence. He realized then that true power didn't need to yell or throw tantrums. True power simply rewrote the rules while you were busy throwing a fit. With a trembling hand, Arthur picked up the pen and signed his name. With every stroke, his empire vanished, transferred over to the man he had called Riffraff. Gregory Pearce collected the documents, checking the signatures before nodding to David. "A pleasure doing business with you all," David said, turning away from the table. As David reached the heavy glass doors, he paused. He looked back over his shoulder at the broken man sitting in the oversized leather chair. "I hear Meridian Airlines is hiring gate agents," David said quietly, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "Though I'd advise against wearing a bespoke suit to the interview. You might get mistaken for someone who actually matters. David pushed the doors open and walked out, leaving Arthur Pendleton alone in the ruins of his own making. The story of Flight 114 serves as a stark modern-day fable about the dangerous illusion of entitlement. We navigate a society that too often assigns worth based on outward appearances, the cut of a suit, the color of a person's skin, or the brand of a watch. But true power and integrity do not need to announce themselves loudly. They sit quietly, deeply rooted in reality. When Beatrice and Arthur allowed their ingrained prejudices to dictate their actions, they didn't just insult a passenger. They blindly walked into the propeller of a machine they couldn't comprehend. Karma in the real world rarely comes from the universe magically balancing the scales. It comes from the natural, devastating consequences of underestimating the people you deem beneath you. Never mistake a quiet demeanor for weakness.